Welcome to Unit 5 using Ajax. Now, what in the heck is Ajax? Well, Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Okay, well, what in the heck is that? Well, really, it's making network requests with JavaScript. So basically, when you open your browser and you type in a URL, that is a network request. Well, your JavaScript code can also do that as well. So these requests can load text from the server to update part of the page, for example. It can load HTML as opposed to plain text. It can actually load rendered stuff to put on your screen. And even better, it can actually load data. Now, I mentioned that Ajax includes the word XML, and you definitely could load XML, but really, most days people use JSON. But really, any type of string-based data, any type of formatted data, including things like a CSV file, that could be loaded via Ajax and then worked with within the page itself. So why would you do that? Well, the big reason is that word asynchronous. What this means is that we can perform a network request and not hang the user up. So for example, the user could ask for a search. Find me all the products that match so-and-so. And instead of making the user wait and locking up the entire page, we could say, hey, okay, we're doing that for you right now, just stand by. We could provide updates as we search. And then once we get that data back, we could show them the results on screen. And again, this all happens in the background asynchronously without blocking the user. That user can keep doing other stuff while those requests are happening. So how can jQuery help us with Ajax? Well, there's a variety of things that jQuery provides to make this easy. The first is the load method, probably the simplest way of doing Ajax. There's also ways of doing get and post type requests. We also have ways to more easily get JSON and actually load remote scripts. We have a core Ajax object that allows us to fine-tune how we're doing things and add different types of filters, etc. We have global event handlers so we can more easily handle multiple different requests. And let's start by taking a look at load. Again, the simplest way of doing Ajax with jQuery. So all it does is load something directly into the DOM, and that's it. It can also filter on a selector as well. So let's look at an example. So I take a selector, content, I do .load, and then I simply tell it what to load. And really, that's all there is. Now, if I want to filter what's loaded based on a selector, I simply put that after the URL. You can see I've done it here, footer.html space paragraph. And in this version, jQuery will load the contents of footer.html, but then find the paragraph tag and show just that particular part. Okay, let's look at an example of this. All right, so here's my first example. I have a button and then I have a blank div with the ID of loading area. I've used an event handler to say when I click that button, I want to load into loading area the contents of footer.html. And really, that's all there is. If we look at footer.html, all it really is just a little fragment of an HTML page. Let's look at this in the browser. All right, here's my page. There's a button, and when I click, ta-da, done. As easy as pie. Let's look at one more example of load. All right, so in this example, I'm passing a selector. So again, I'm saying I want to load footer.html, but I only want to show what's in the p tag. If we go back to footer, you can see it's just this portion here, and really I could use any selector I want. But again, what this will do is it'll load the entire contents of footer.html, but only put into loading area what match that selector for the p tag. Let's look at this in the browser. All right, same button again, and I click to load, and now notice it just loaded the paragraph portion from that particular footer.html file. Now keep in mind that I'm still loading the entire page. So if you're trying to ensure that you're not loading a lot of data via Ajax, Using the selector is not cutting down on the amount of data. It's simply filtering what gets sent back into the DOM item that we're loading. Just something to keep in mind. So let's talk about get and post. So to be clear, these represent different HTTP methods. So normally, get is used just to fetch something, whereas post is used when you're sending form data. Now, you don't have to follow these rules, but typically it's a good idea to do so. So jQuery makes it pretty easy to do both of these. Now, this is one of the few times where we don't use a selector. So in the code example there, you see just $. Again, that is the jQuery library .get. I pass in the URL, and then I simply have a function that's going to run when the result comes back. That gets past a couple of things. The pure data, essentially what was in something.html, a status result, as well as a generic XHR object wrapped in jQuery. Normally though, all we really care about is that data result. I could get a bit more complex and actually pass data along as well. In this case, I have a variable called me. It's just a string, my name. And then I pass it as the second argument to get as an object. I say user:me to say I want to pass an argument along with that request called user, and the value is me. Finally, I can also give a clue to jQuery about what I'm getting back. So that last argument, HTML, is telling jQuery, when you get this stuff back, it's going to be HTML. You don't have to worry about doing anything special with it. Later on, when we talk about working with JSON, this will become a bit more important. All right, let's look at some examples. All right, this is my first example, and really this is a repeat of that first load example. It's essentially doing the same thing, but written using $.get instead. So I'm asking for the exact same HTML, footer.html, and when I get the result in that callback, I'm simply putting it into loading area. So really, this is the exact same code as the first load example, just written a little bit differently. Let's look at this in the browser just to make sure it works. All right, here's the page, same button again, and I click Get Stuff and it works. Notice that I also sent to the console all the arguments sent back, and we could look at these and inspect them to see what came back. In this case, I can actually see that's the raw HTML, and that is the status message saying that it was a success. Let's look at one more example. This one is actually taking a value from a form field, and it's going to pass it along with that GET request as a variable called name. Now, I'm calling an application server, and I don't expect that you have an application server on your system. That's okay. It's not really important. In this case, my application server is just taking the input and reversing it. Now, in my particular example, I'm using Cold Fusion. You could easily do this in PHP, Node, etc. Or if you have none of those, you can also just switch to hitting a plain text file as well. But I wanted to show an example of taking user input, sending it to some application via Ajax, having the application do something, in this case, just reversing text, which, by the way, you can do more easier in JavaScript, and then taking that result and then just showing it in the DOM. Let's take a look at this and see how it works. All right, there's my form. I will type in a name. We'll do Luke. Click my function. And again, the Ajax request went to my application server. The application server just reversed that string and spit it right back out. And I was able to take that result then and put it right back into my DOM. So what about post request? Well, post looks pretty much exactly like a GET request. The only thing I did here was change $.get to $.post. The rest of the API is the exact same. So why would you use one over the other? Well, when you use a GET request, any additional data like that name value is passed along the query string. That's stuff at the end of the URL. There is a limit to how big that URL can get. Now in my case, I'm sending one small value from a text field. If I had a large form with text areas, there could be a lot of data and be easier to hit that limit on the query string. So typically, if I'm doing a form that includes more than one field, I'll almost always use post. And sometimes the server we're hitting is what is going to tell us what we have to use. It may require a post. It may require query string variables. So it really comes down to essentially how much data and what your API requires. So let's look at a simple example of this. So once again, I'm repeating what you saw in the initial load example. I'm doing a post request to footer.html. Now that's kind of silly. Footer.html, it's not a Cold Fusion or a PHP file. It's not anything. But you know what? That's actually okay. It's kind of wasteful in terms of how much data we're sending, but it's going to work just fine and spit out the same results in my loading area. Because it's the exact same as the get example and the load example, I won't bother showing this in the browser. Now here is a slightly more advanced example, but really it's just kind of mimicking the second get one as well. So my application server supports both post and get request, so I can do $.post and send that name value. Now again, I have no concerns about the name fitting on the query string. But if that input tag, if that was a text area, then I could definitely hit that limit. But what's cool is that if I make that mistake and run into that bug, fixing it takes all of 2 seconds to switch from $.get to $.post. And again, I won't run this because it has the exact same output as before. So far you've seen examples of working with just simple HTML stuff that we're loading in via Ajax. How about working with JSON? So JSON is JavaScript data in a string format. Basically, it's a string, simple text, that the browser can then turn into real data. This makes it pretty darn useful for sending data like a list of people, a product with different values, etc. Both the get and post methods can be told to work with JSON. And there's also a get JSON shortcut that'll make it a bit more obvious. So instead of having to tell get and post that they're getting something with JSON, get JSON will just know that the result is supposed to be JSON data. Let's look at a few examples of this. So for my first example, I'm doing a $.get to a text file. Now that text file actually does contain JSON, and this is actually going to break, and that's okay. I'm going to do a console.log on that data to see what came back. Let's look at this in the browser. All right, here's my button. I will click Get Stuff, and there is my string data back. Well, I don't want a string, I actually want data back, but jQuery wasn't aware that I was actually getting something that was JSON based. Let's fix that. All right, so here is one way of fixing it. All I did was use that last argument, JSON, to tell jQuery that, hey, what you're getting back is JSON, so treat it as such. jQuery will now parse that data and give me an object back as opposed to a simple string. Let's make sure we're right. All right, same button again, but now when we click it, we get a real object back. This is pure data that I can work with and do, cool stuff with. Let's look at more examples. So this version looks a lot like the first. I did not specify a type, but notice that now I'm getting data.json. What happens here is that jQuery does some intelligent sniffing and guessing pretty much. And when it sees .json in the URL, it says, oh, you know what? I bet you're getting data. Because it can guess like this, I don't have to tell it what the type is. Let's make sure we're right. All right. Let's click that button one more time, and there we go. We got an object back. Let's go back to look at some more examples. All right, we have one more example here, but I'm back to hitting the text file, so that will confuse jQuery, right? But notice that I switched to the get JSON method. So this is pretty much the exact same thing as saying $.get and telling it that the type is going to be JSON. Once again, let's just make sure we're right and view this in the browser. All right, there's that button one more time. Let's click it, and it worked. Of course it did, but you know what? I always like to check to make sure. All right, one more example, and then we're done with this part. You see me get JSON data, but not actually use it. So now I'm going to take that data packet, and again, it was string data, but jQuery turned it into real data for me. And because of that, I can build a string and then inject that string into my loading area div. So my data packet has a name and an age. So I begin by saying my name is data.name and I'm data.age years old. It also has an array of things I like. So I can loop over that array and create an unordered list. Finally, when I'm all done, I just take that string, plop it into the DOM, and I have dynamic content in my DOM based on Ajax data. So if data.json was actually some application server, that could actually change values based on whatever condition makes sense. Let's run this and see what we get. All right, there's that lovely button again. Let's click it and boom, there is my data. So far you've seen some really simple ideas on how to do Ajax requests and then show it on the page. Now, all of my testing has been on my local server, so everything was pretty much instantaneous. But as we know, the internet is anything but instantaneous. So can we provide feedback to the user so that they know something is going on? Now remember, they won't know that your JavaScript code is running. They are not doing view source probably. They really have no idea that when they hit that button, something happened. So the best thing we can do is tell the user. Say, hey, you know what? You asked me to search for something. I'm going to go search for it. Give me a second and I'll be right back. Oh, look, here's the data. Here it is. I'll put it on screen. Let's look at an example of this. Okay. So what I have here is my form where I'm taking in a name value and I am reversing it. Now what I did is I modified my backend code to wait for 5 whole seconds while it's doing whatever, and then it returns the data. So this is an unoptimized form and the experience is going to be kind of bad. Let's take a look at that first. All right, here's the form. I'll type in my name, Raymond, and hit the button. Now something's happening, right? It's working, but I have no idea. There's no feedback. There's a result finally, but a lot of users would probably end up hitting that button multiple times. They wouldn't know that something was going on. Luckily, jQuery makes it really easy to fix this. Let's look at that. So I've done a couple of things here to provide feedback to the user. The first thing I do in line 14 is actually write to that results area that, hey, you know what? I'm doing something. In this case, I just put some simple text, but I could also do that little loading widget that every other website uses. I also modified that form button to take off the ability to click it. I set the attribute disabled to the value disabled, and that makes the button unclickable. So then I carry on my merry way. I get the value, I do my post, but now when I'm done, the results will overwrite that loading message, and then I use remove attr. This is something we haven't seen before, but you could probably guess what it's going to do. It's going to remove an attribute, and that will re-enable the button. Let's view this and see how much better the experience is now. All right, there's my form, and now when I click, type in a name and hit that button, watch, the button is turned off and there's that nice message. And then finally, boom, it's back. My button's re-enabled and I can click it again if I wanted. So everything you've seen so far have been shorthand methods. And all of these shorthand methods wrap a call to $.Ajax. $.Ajax is kind of like the core Ajax functionality for jQuery. Everything builds on top of it and allows for much deeper customization. So for example, if you wanted to modify the headers of that HTTP request, you could. If you wanted to modify how the call goes out, actually change the data before it's sent, as well as changing the result before you get it, you can do that as well. If you're working with something that requires security, perhaps a username and password, you can include that in the actual HTTP request. There's a lot more that you could set, and really just depends on what API you're working with. You may have to set some things one time and other things the other times. Here's an example of it, $.Ajax, and all I'm doing now is specifying all the things I care about as different keys to that argument. I have a URL, I have data, my success function is, well, run when a success happens. I have the type, so this matches to $.post, and I'm also saying that I'm getting HTML back. Let's look at a few examples of this. So as my first example, once again, I replicated what you saw in the very first example. Click a button, load footer.html, and put the results into loading area. This is the $.Ajax version of it. Definitely a bit more typing, but what's nice is that if I had to do anything weird, like set a header or something like that, it's going to be easier to work with this than the others. Now, because I've shown this example so many times, I won't show it again. So here's a modified version of that get.json example where I worked with the JSON data and drew something out. I'm specifying a URL. I'm specifying a success function to run when done. And I'm saying that, by the way, I'm working with JSON. Now, I probably don't need that because the URL contains JSON, but you know what? It's not dangerous to be a bit more specific. Now, just to be sure on this one, let's go ahead and run it and see the result. All right, there's my lovely button again. I click it and it works. So again, essentially all I've done is rewrite what I had before, but now I have a bit more power if I want to customize it a bit. Now, for the last example, I'm showing one of the really nice things we could do with the $.Ajax method, and that's actually handle errors a bit nicer. Now, in this case, I've switched my URL to one that does not exist. Now, my success handler will not run, but my error handler will run instead. This is definitely a better version because now I'm handling the possibility of something going wrong, and as we all know, things definitely can go wrong. Let's watch this in the browser. All right, here's my demo, and now I should hopefully get the error that I expect. And bam, there it is, and you can also see it in the console as well. In this case, it was a file not found error. This will also run for other errors, obviously, as well, and you could do different things. You could look at that string and say, if it's not found, do one thing. If it's another error, do something else. Now, so far, everything I've done has been on my local server. It's been the same domain, and there's a reason for that, because you can't hit remote servers. If you try to use jQuery to load something on a different server, by default, the browser will block this. So a call like that is just not going to work. Unfortunately, you will forget this. Everybody forgets this when they learn jQuery. The first time you do it and it fails, so hopefully you will remember that this is not a jQuery bug. It's not a bug in your code. It's the browser saying, hey, you know what? I don't really trust you to load remote stuff. This could be an evil script. Let me just block this by default. Now, thankfully, there's multiple workarounds. One way is simply to use a local application server. So if I needed to hit something on some remote server, I can actually write code on my server using Cold Fusion, PHP, Node, etc. that does that HTTP call for me. So essentially, my jQuery code hits my local script hits the remote script, gets the data, spits it back out, and then jQuery gets that result, and we're all good. That's one way. Another way is something called CORS, Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. Now, this is something that's kind of new. It's only supported in the more modern browsers. But basically, if on the remote server, on their API, if they set it up correctly, the browser will allow you to hit it remotely. Now again, this is only going to be for more modern browsers. The final option is JSON-P, or JSON with padding. So JSON-P is a hack. You should be aware of that. But it's a hack that's been around for a very, very long time, and it's used so much that it's okay. Normally we say don't try hacks, but this one has been around for a while and it's well thought out. Essentially, what it does is it adds a script tag to your DOM. Why? Because you're allowed to have a script tag that points to a remote URL. So JSON-P is essentially a way of faking a GET request to that remote data by doing it via a script tag. It's essentially a workaround for the block that's typically there. Now, in order to use this, the remote server has to play along. Now, in that, it actually outputs a JSON in a slightly different format. We're not going to worry about that because we're not building a backend server for that. But again, because this hack has been around for so long, a lot of APIs out there will support JSON-P and will say so in their documentation. Let's look at an example of this. All right, so here's my example where, once again, I'm using a simple button to send some data. But in this case, I'm using GitHub's API. GitHub supports JSON-P. So how do I use it with jQuery? I do a normal $.get, and then I tell it that the type is JSON-P. And really, that's it. Even though this looks like it's going to do an HTTP request to GitHub, it's not. jQuery will take this, it will append the script block, GitHub's API will recognize that I'm using JSON-P and it'll change the JSON a bit to make it work right. And then it just plain works. Let's look at this in the browser. And as a quick aside, actually GitHub does support cores as well, so even this isn't necessary. But using JSON-P makes sure that even the older browsers will still be able to run this demo. All right, here's my form. And again, we're going to hit GitHub. So let's search for something that I know will bring stuff back. jQuery. Hit that button and I get my result. Now I didn't actually render it on screen. I just sent to my console. Great debugging tool. But I could see all of those results. In this case, 56,000. No big surprise there. But again, this was a remote call done via the hack that jQuery just made incredibly easy to use. So let's talk about one more thing that comes up when you use Ajax, specifically selectors and Ajax content. Now, you've seen how to select stuff. I talked about how important selectors are, and you've seen many, many examples. You've also seen how and why to use document.ready. You can't select something that may not be there yet. So using document.ready is a way of saying, you know what, probably all my stuff is ready. Now I want to select against it. But unfortunately, Ajax really kind of throws a wrinkle into this. So if I hit that search button, then I get stuff back and I write that stuff into the DOM, I can't do a selector for that in document.ready because even though my page is loaded, the stuff that I'm going to eventually load via Ajax isn't there yet. So how do I do this? So typically, I would have a class, for example, Ajax stuff, .click, and run console.log on it. That would find everything with that class and then add a click handler to it. That's typically how I would do it. Well, let's see how this breaks down when that stuff is loaded via Ajax. All right, so here's my example. I'm loading stuff.json, rendering it on screen. And what I do, I'm going to use a paragraph with a class of stuff. I also want to know when you click on there. So this should work, right? And you could probably guess it's going to fail. But let's see it fail first. All right, let's get our stuff and let's click. And as we kind of expected, it failed. But now we know why at least. Going back to our code, we know this selector, it did run after the whole page had loaded, but it ran before the Ajax stuff fired. Now, as you could probably guess, I could possibly just copy this stuff into my success handler, but that makes that code a bit messier. Let's look at a better way of fixing that. If you remember, I said that the on event was kind of the core way of doing events. And I mentioned that it was pretty powerful. Well, one of the ways that it's powerful is that I can actually run the on handler on some parent, but filter it on things inside it. So in this example, I'm saying select parent thing. And I'm saying when event happens, and that could be click, double click, whatever, I want you to run a handler, but I want you to only do it when it matches my selector. So basically, if I clicked inside parent thing, but only if it matched that particular selector. What's nice about this is that because parent thing is going to exist when I set this up, I could change things inside parent thing, change it via Ajax or any method really at all. And then this event handler will run because it's tied to the thing that was visible on page load. And that may be a bit confusing. Let's look at this in code. Okay, this is the exact same example. The only thing I've done is kind of modify my click handler a bit. I'm saying look at loading area, listen for click, but only when the thing has a class of stuff. Now when these things are loaded via Ajax, after the page loads, after document.ready, I know that my event handler is still going to work because loading area was there initially. jQuery was able to find it. When this handler runs, when a click is detected in loading area, jQuery will first filter it on stuff and then run the handler if it matches. Let's view this and see what happens. All right, here's that button again. We'll click on Get Stuff. There's my results, and hopefully, sweet, it worked. So again, if you're going to load any content via Ajax and you want to do event handlers on it, normally you're going to want to use the on event and do this filtering.